The uniform was her stepmother's idea of a joke. Elizabeth did not laugh. She had worn it in silence that morning, her fingers numb as she fastened the last button, her reflection in the mirror something she did not recognize and did not wish to. A white cap, a gray dress, the same gray dress the kitchen girls wore. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself she had survived worse in the 2 years since her father died. She told herself that one evening, just one, could not break what was already so carefully held together. She carried the tray through the gilded doors of Ashford Hall and kept her eyes down. The room smelled of candlelight and expensive perfume, and the particular kind of laughter that belongs only to people who have never had to count their pennies. Crystal glasses caught the chandelier light. Silk gowns whispered against marble floors. Voices rose and fell around her like a tide she was no longer permitted to swim in. She moved carefully. Invisible. That was the instruction her stepmother had given her in the carriage. Be invisible, Elizabeth. It is the one thing you are suited for. She had almost reached the far end of the room when she heard it. His voice. Low, unhurried, cutting through the noise of the room like a blade through water. Her hands went still. The tray tilted. A glass shivered. She caught it barely and stood frozen behind a column of marble, her heart doing something she had spent 2 years training it not to do. She knew that voice. She had tried very hard to forget it. 2 years earlier, it had been her father's idea. You need to be seen, my darling, Lord Calloway had said, adjusting his cufflinks in the mirror of their townhouse on Grosvenor Street, back when there was still a townhouse, back when there was still a father to fill it. You are 20 years old and you spend more time in the library than in any room with windows. This is not a sustainable strategy. Elizabeth had pointed out that the library had 2 windows. Her father had kissed her forehead and handed her a pair of gloves. The dinner at Lord Pemberton's house had been exactly what she expected. Too many people, too much noise, and conversation that moved like a game she did not know the rules to. She had stationed herself near the bookshelf at the far end of the drawing room, which she felt was a reasonable compromise between attending and not attending. She had been examining the spine of a rather battered volume of Montaigne when someone had spoken beside her. He writes better than he is given credit for. She had turned. The man standing beside her was tall, dark-haired, and watching her with an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite curiosity, something balanced carefully between the two. She did not know his face. She did not yet know his name. She knew only that he was looking at the book in her hands as though it were a perfectly natural thing to be looking at in the middle of a dinner party, which made her like him immediately and against her better judgment. Most people find him tedious, she said. Most people find anything tedious that requires them to question themselves. He tilted his head slightly. Are you hiding? I am browsing. From across the room it looked like hiding. From across the room, she said, you were watching someone you did not know. Which of us should be more embarrassed? He had laughed then, a real laugh, not the performed kind she had been hearing all evening, and held out his hand. Edmund Ashford. She had shaken it before the name fully registered. When it did, she kept her expression perfectly still, which took considerable effort. The Duke of Ravensmore, one of the most prominent men in London, standing beside a bookshelf at a dinner party, telling her she looked like she was hiding. Elizabeth Calloway, she said. Lord Calloway's daughter. The very same. He had smiled, not the wide, performing smile of men who wanted to be seen smiling, but something quieter, something that reached his eyes without making an announcement of it. They had spoken for 20 minutes, about Montaigne, about the particular agony of dinner party conversation, about a small village in Derbyshire where they had both, at different times and for different reasons, spent a summer they both remembered as unusually peaceful. 20 minutes, it had felt like less, it had felt like more. When her father found her and drew her away to greet another family, she had not looked back. She told herself she did not need to. 3 days later, the first letter arrived. She read every word 3 times. Then she folded it, placed it carefully in the box beneath her bed, and did not write back. The second letter arrived 11 days later. She knew it was from him before she opened it. The handwriting on the envelope was the same, controlled, precise, with one small inconsistency in the capital L that she had noticed the first time and had not been able to stop noticing since. She did not know what it meant that she had memorized the handwriting of a man she had met for 20 minutes at a dinner party. She chose not to examine it. She opened the letter by the window of her bedroom, standing so that the light fell over her shoulder, and she read it the way she had read the first one, carefully, and then again, and then once more. He wrote the way he spoke, without performance, without the elaborate courtesies that men of his position typically arranged around their words like decorative fencing. He asked how she had found the rest of Lord Pemberton's evening. He mentioned that he had, after their conversation, gone home and reread the Montaigne essay they had discussed, and found it considerably more interesting than he had remembered. He said, and this was the line she read 4 times instead of 3, that he had not spoken to anyone at a dinner party in quite that way in longer than he cared to admit, and that he hoped she would not find it presumptuous if he wrote again. It was not presumptuous. That was the problem. Elizabeth folded the letter and placed it in the box beneath her bed, beside the first one. Then she sat at her writing desk for a long time, looking at the blank page in front of her, her pen in her hand. She did not write back. The reason had a name. Clara Voss had been Elizabeth's closest friend since they were 12 years old. Seated beside each other at a music lesson, they had both been equally unwilling to attend. They had been inseparable in the way that only girls who have found each other in a world that does not quite make sense can be, finishing each other's sentences, sharing books and secrets, and the particular shorthand of people who have known each other long enough to stop explaining themselves. Clara was beautiful in the way that rooms noticed, dark-eyed, quick-laughing, magnetic in a way that Elizabeth had always admired without envy because it had never seemed like something to compete with. It was simply Clara. It was simply how she was. Clara had seen Edmund Ashford for the first time at a garden party the previous spring. Elizabeth had been standing beside her. She remembered the exact moment. Clara had gone very still, not her usual stillness, which was the stillness of someone about to say something devastating, but a different kind. A quiet kind. The kind that meant something had reached her in a place she did not usually let things reach. "Who is that?" Clara had asked. Elizabeth had told her. Clara had watched him across the garden for the rest of the afternoon without speaking to him, which was entirely unlike her. And on the carriage ride home she had said, very quietly, as though testing whether she could survive saying it out loud, "If he ever looked at me the way I just looked at him, I would ask for nothing else in my life. I mean that, Elizabeth. I have never meant anything more." Elizabeth had said nothing. She had taken Clara's hand and held it and looked out the carriage window at the darkening street and said nothing at all. That had been 4 months before Lord Pemberton's dinner party. 4 months before Edmund Ashford had stood beside a bookshelf and laughed at something she said like it was the most natural thing in the world. The third letter arrived in October, the fourth in November. She read each one by the window, standing so the light fell over her shoulder, and she read each one carefully and then again and then once more. Each one was different. Each one was, and this was the word she kept returning to and kept trying to put down, kind. Not charming, not strategic. Kind in the way of someone who was not trying to be anything other than what they were. She did not write back. She put each letter in the box beneath her bed and told herself that this was the right thing. Clara had not chosen Edmund Ashford. Clara had not engineered a meeting, or written letters, or done anything at all except fall quietly and completely for someone at a garden party, the way people do sometimes without permission or planning. It was not Clara's fault. And Elizabeth had simply been standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, next to a bookshelf, with a copy of Montaigne in her hands. It was not a great love story. It was a coincidence. It would pass. She told herself this in October. She told herself this in November. By December, she had almost begun to believe it. The fifth letter did not come. She told herself she was relieved. She told herself she had not noticed the exact date by which it should have arrived, if he were keeping to the same intervals as before. She told herself that the box beneath her bed was simply a box, and that she kept the letters because throwing them away seemed wasteful, and that she did not take them out and read them again on the nights when the house was quiet and the year was ending, and she felt, without quite being able to name why, profoundly and specifically alone. Clara never knew. And Elizabeth told herself that was enough. Her father died on a Tuesday. Elizabeth always remembered that detail with a particular bitterness, not the grand, dramatic bitterness of tragedy, but the small, stupid bitterness of a fact that refused to mean anything. Tuesday, an ordinary day, the kind of day on which nothing should be permitted to end. He had been ill for 3 months, which was long enough to be frightening and not long enough to be prepared for. She had sat beside his bed every morning and read to him, Montaigne sometimes, because he liked the essays and because reading them aloud gave her something to do with her hands and her voice and the fear that lived permanently in her chest those last weeks. He had slept more than he spoke. But on the good days he had opened his eyes and looked at her with an expression she could not name then and cannot name now, something between apology and pride, which is perhaps the particular expression of fathers who know they are leaving too soon. He had held her hand on the last morning. He had said, "You are stronger than you know, my darling. I am sorry I will not be there to see it." Then he had closed his eyes. And the floor had disappeared. Margaret Calloway, née Forsyth, widow, Elizabeth's stepmother of 4 years, had worn black for exactly 3 weeks. Elizabeth had noticed. She had counted, in the mechanical way of someone who has run out of larger things to feel and so attaches feeling to small ones. 23 days. Then the black was exchanged for gray, and then for lavender, and then for a deep rose that Margaret apparently felt was still technically within the acceptable range of mourning, which Elizabeth felt it was not, but Elizabeth's feelings on the subject had ceased to be consulted. The house changed quickly after that. Not all at once, that would have been too obvious, too easy to name and fight. It changed the way water changes the shape of stone, slowly, consistently, and without ever appearing to be doing anything at all. The household accounts passed to Margaret. The correspondence passed to Margaret. The staff, most of whom had been with the Calloway family since before Elizabeth was born, were replaced, one by one, with people who answered only to Margaret. Mrs. Hale, who had run the kitchen for 20 years and who made the particular kind of shortbread that Elizabeth's mother had loved, was let go in April. The gardener who had taught Elizabeth the names of every flower in the back garden was gone by May. By June, Elizabeth understood what was happening. By July, she understood that understanding it made no difference at all. She had no income of her own, no property, no legal standing that Margaret could not simply wait out. Her father's estate, such as it remained after debts Elizabeth had not known existed, passed in trust to Margaret until Elizabeth married, a fact that her father's solicitor communicated with the expression of a man delivering news he finds personally distasteful but professionally binding. She was, in every way that the law recognized, dependent. Margaret knew it, and Margaret, Elizabeth began to understand, had been waiting quite patiently for exactly this. Clara had not come to the funeral. She had sent a note, beautifully written, full of the right words in the right order, explaining that she was unwell, that she was devastated not to be there, that Elizabeth was in her thoughts constantly. Elizabeth had read the note twice and then placed it on the mantelpiece and looked at it for a long time. 3 weeks after the funeral, she had heard through a mutual acquaintance that Clara had spent the week of her father's death in Bath, attending a series of parties in the company of a young cavalry officer named Captain Rowe, whom Clara had apparently found quite compelling. Elizabeth had not responded to this information in any visible way. She had taken the note from the mantelpiece and put it in a drawer. She had not taken it out again. By autumn, she heard that Clara and Captain Rowe were considered a settled thing, inseparable at every event, the captain apparently devoted, Clara apparently radiant. People said it with the particular warmth reserved for love stories that confirm their faith in the world working out as it should. Elizabeth heard it and felt something she was not proud of feeling. Not grief exactly, and not anger exactly, but the specific exhaustion of someone who has paid a price and discovered, too late, that the thing they were protecting no longer needed protecting. She had given up Edmund Ashford's letters for Clara. Clara had not asked her to. Clara had not known. Clara had simply fallen in love at a garden party, said one true thing in a carriage, and then gotten on with her life. And Elizabeth put on her coat and went for a long walk and came home and made herself a cup of tea, and did not allow herself to finish the thought. The box beneath her bed still had 4 letters in it. She had moved it twice as Margaret rearranged the house, first to the back of the wardrobe, then behind a loose board in the floor that she had discovered as a child and never told anyone about. She could not have explained, if asked, why she kept them. They were from a man she had not spoken to in over a year. They were from a life that no longer existed. They served no practical purpose and carried considerable risk. If Margaret found them, she would use them somehow. Margaret had a talent for using things. But every time Elizabeth thought about letting them go, she found she could not. She told herself it was foolishness. She told herself it was sentiment, which was merely foolishness with a more flattering name. It was. And on the nights when Margaret's voice carried through the walls, and the house felt very large and very cold and very much like somewhere she did not belong, she would reach behind the loose board and simply place her hand on the box. She did not open it. She did not need to. She remembered every word. It was Margaret who received the invitation to Ashford Hall. She announced it at breakfast on a Thursday morning in October, 2 years after Lord Calloway's death, with the particular brightness of a woman who has just confirmed something she had been working toward for quite some time. The Duke of Ravensmore was hosting a dinner, an important dinner. Half of London would be there. Margaret's daughter Sophia would attend, naturally. Sophia was 22 and handsome, and had been pointed in the direction of eligible men, with the focused energy of a woman who considered matrimony a military campaign. Elizabeth would attend also. She had looked up from her tea at that, surprised. Margaret rarely included her in anything that could be construed as an opportunity. Then Margaret had smiled, the particular smile that never quite reached her eyes, and told her what she would be wearing. The gray dress, the white cap. You will carry the tray, Elizabeth. You will keep to the edges of the room. You will not speak unless spoken to, and if anyone asks, you are one of the hired staff for the evening. Do you understand? Elizabeth had looked at her stepmother across the breakfast table for a long moment. Then she had set down her cup. Yes, she said, I understand perfectly. She still had the letters. She did not know why she kept them. She told herself it was foolishness. It was. The gray dress was worse than she had imagined. Not because it was ugly, it was plain, simply cut, the kind of garment designed to be practical and nothing else. But Elizabeth had grown up in this world. She knew its rules the way she knew the layout of her own hands. And she understood, with a clarity that required no explanation, exactly what the gray dress meant in a room full of silk and candlelight. It meant she is no one. It meant do not look at her. It meant she was here and she did not matter. Margaret had delivered it to her room the evening before without ceremony, folded, pressed, accompanied by a white cap and a pair of plain black shoes that were half a size too small. Elizabeth had picked up the dress and held it and breathed carefully for a count of 10, which was a technique she had developed over the past 2 years for moments when breathing was the only thing she could control. Then she had hung it on the back of the door and gone to bed. She had not slept. Ashford Hall was exactly what its name suggested: large, old, certain of itself in the way that only buildings which have survived several centuries can afford to be. It sat at the end of a long gravel drive flanked by elm trees, lit from within so that the windows glowed amber against the October dark. And as the carriage rolled toward it, Elizabeth sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance, and thought about nothing in particular with great concentration. Margaret sat across from her, examining her reflection in a small hand mirror. Sophia sat beside her mother, adjusting her gloves, her expression the carefully composed excitement of a young woman who has been told that tonight may be important and has taken the instructions seriously. Neither of them spoke to Elizabeth. This was normal. Elizabeth had stopped expecting otherwise. The carriage stopped. A footman opened the door. Margaret descended first, then Sophia, both of them smoothing their skirts and lifting their chins in the practiced way of women entering a room they intend to conquer. Elizabeth descended last. She carried the tray. The entrance hall of Ashford Hall smelled of beeswax and hothouse flowers, and something older underneath, wood and stone, and the particular cool stillness of a house that has stood long enough to have its own weather. Voices drifted from the drawing room ahead. Laughter. The bright percussion of crystal and silver. A housekeeper, a real one, gray-haired and efficient, had met them at the door and directed the guests toward the drawing room and the staff toward the servants' corridor. Elizabeth had followed the servants' corridor without being asked, which she felt Margaret appreciated as an act of cooperation, and which Elizabeth performed as an act of pure, quiet survival. The kitchen was warm and busy and smelled of roasting meat and butter, and the particular controlled chaos of a large dinner in its final hour of preparation. No one paid her any attention. She was given a tray of champagne glasses, already filled, already gleaming, and was pointed toward the drawing room with a nod. She stood for a moment in the corridor, outside the drawing room door. She could hear the party on the other side. The noise of it, the warmth of it. 2 years ago she would have walked through that door as a guest. She would have accepted a glass of champagne and looked for a bookshelf and tried to find one person worth talking to. 2 years ago her father had been alive. 2 years ago she had a box of 4 letters beneath her bed, and a feeling she refused to name. She straightened her spine, she adjusted the tray, she kept her eyes down. And she walked through the door. The room was everything she had expected, and several things she had not. It was large, larger than it looked from outside, with ceilings that rose into shadow and walls lined with portraits of people who all shared the same particular expression of composed authority. The chandelier above scattered light across the room in pieces, catching the crystal glasses and the jewels at women's throats and the silver buttons on the men's coats. There were perhaps 40 people, perhaps more. They moved and spoke and laughed, and Elizabeth moved between them like water finding the lowest path, quiet, unobtrusive, offering her tray when a hand reached for it, and withdrawing before anyone had to acknowledge her presence. She was very good at this by now. She did not look up. There was no benefit to looking up. Looking up meant seeing faces she might recognize, which meant remembering things she had decided not to remember, which meant feeling things she had decided not to feel. eyes down, tray level, one end of the room to the other. She had almost reached the far end, she was so close when she heard it. His voice. She could not have said afterward what he was saying. Something that made the people around him laugh. Something offhand and easy, delivered with the quiet confidence of a man who is not trying to be the most interesting person in the room and has somehow become it anyway. Low, unhurried, cutting through the noise like a blade through water. Her hands went still. The tray tilted. A glass shivered at the edge and she caught it, barely, her fingers closing around the stem a half-second before disaster, and stood frozen behind a column of marble, her heart doing something she had spent 2 years and considerable effort training it not to do. She knew that voice. She had tried very hard to forget it. She had not forgotten it. For a long moment she simply stood there behind the column, her tray steady again, her breathing deliberate. She was being ridiculous. She was a woman holding a tray of champagne glasses at a dinner party, and across the room there was a man speaking to his guests, and there was absolutely no reason for her heart to be behaving as though it had forgotten its primary function was to be quiet and do its job. She straightened. She breathed. She reminded herself of every relevant fact. 2 years, 4 letters, a gray dress, a white cap, half a size too small shoes that were beginning to make their displeasure known. Then she stepped out from behind the column and continued across the room. She kept her eyes down. She did not look at him. She almost managed it. She was 3 steps from the door to the corridor, 3 steps. She had counted them. She had been counting since the column when she felt it. Not a sound, not a movement, something else. The particular quality of attention that changes the air in a room without making any noise at all. She stopped. She looked up. Edmund Ashford was standing 20 feet away, in conversation with 2 men she did not recognize, a glass of champagne in one hand, and the expression of a man who had been saying something and had, mid-sentence, forgotten entirely what it was. He was looking at her. Not the way men at parties looked at women holding trays through them, past them, registering the glass and not the hand that carried it. He was looking at her the way she remembered from Lord Pemberton's drawing room 2 years ago, beside the bookshelf, which was directly and without apology, and with that particular quality she had never quite found a word for. His expression did not change. That was what undid her slightly, that his face gave nothing away. No shock, no pity, no performance of recognition for the benefit of the room. He simply looked at her for one long, level moment, and then he returned his attention to the men beside him and continued whatever sentence he had abandoned. As though nothing had happened. As though she were simply a woman with a tray. Elizabeth turned and walked through the door to the corridor and stood in the cool quiet of the servants' passage and pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes. Her hands were entirely steady. She was very proud of her hands. She was less proud of everything else. She went back in. She had no choice, and in any case she was not someone who hid in corridors. She hid behind columns, which was entirely different and considerably more dignified. She took the tray and she moved through the room and she was invisible, which was what she was here to be, and she was perfectly fine. She was almost perfectly fine. She was fine. He did not approach her. He did not look at her again, or if he did, she did not catch him doing it, which amounted to the same thing. He moved through his guests with the ease of a man entirely comfortable in his own house, which he was because it was his house, which she kept reminding herself of because it seemed important to remember that she was the one who did not belong here. She told herself this firmly and repeatedly for the next 2 hours. It helped less than she would have liked. The dinner was announced at 8 o'clock. Elizabeth retreated to the edge of the room as the guests began to move toward the dining hall, her tray exchanged now for a smaller one, bearing the after-dinner arrangements that the housekeeper had directed her to carry through. She stayed close to the wall. She watched the guests file past. Margaret passed her without a glance. Sophia passed her with one, brief, satisfied, the particular look of a young woman who has just confirmed that the competition is carrying a tray. And then, Miss Voss, low, quiet, directly beside her. Elizabeth went very still. She turned her head. Edmund Ashford was standing close enough that she could see the exact shade of his eyes, which she had remembered incorrectly. She had remembered them as dark, but they were not dark. They were the specific gray of early morning before the light has decided what it wants to be. He was looking at her with an expression she could not read, and he had called her by the wrong name. Her stepmother's name. Her stepmother's married name, which was not her name, which had never been her name. She held his gaze for one moment. "It is Miss Calloway," she said quietly. "It always was." Something moved across his face, gone before she could name it. "Yes," he said. A pause, brief, deliberate. "I know." Dinner was served at 8:30. Elizabeth did not sit at the table. She stood at the edge of the dining room with the other hired staff, moving forward when needed and backward when not. And she watched 40 people eat a 6-course meal in a room that smelled of roasting pheasant and beeswax candles, and the particular kind of money that has been in a family long enough to stop announcing itself. She was good at watching. She had always been good at watching. It was, she had decided somewhere in the last 2 years, the one advantage of becoming invisible: you saw everything, because no one thought to hide anything from someone who wasn't there. She watched Margaret work the table from 3 seats down from the hostess, angling every conversation towards Sophia with the practiced efficiency of a woman who has converted charm into a professional skill. She watched Sophia smile at the right moments and laugh at the right moments, and tilt her head in the particular way that suggested attentiveness, whether or not she was actually attending. Sophia was not unintelligent. She simply had a mother who had taught her that intelligence was most useful when it looked like something else. She watched Edmund Ashford at the head of his table. She told herself she was not watching Edmund Ashford. She was watching the room. Edmund Ashford was simply in the room. This was a distinction without a meaningful difference, and she was aware of that, and she continued making it anyway because the alternative was to admit something she was not prepared to admit while wearing a white cap and holding a serving dish. He was a good host. She noticed this despite herself, the way he moved the conversation, drawing in the quieter guests, deflecting the louder ones with a word or a question that redirected without seeming to. He laughed when something was genuinely funny and not when it wasn't, which in her experience was rarer than it should have been in rooms like this. He listened when people spoke to him. Actually listened, which was different from the performance of listening that most people offered in its place. She had remembered this about him, from 20 minutes beside a bookshelf 2 years ago. She had remembered quite a lot of things about him that she had spent considerable effort trying not to remember. He did not look at her during dinner. Or rather, she did not catch him looking at her during dinner, which she had already established amounted to the same thing, and which she was beginning to suspect did not actually amount to the same thing at all. Because twice, when she moved from the edge of the room to the table to assist with the serving, she felt it again, that quality of attention, that change in the air, and both times when she looked up he was in conversation with someone else, his eyes elsewhere, his expression entirely appropriate to whatever was being discussed. He was very good at it. She was not sure what it was. She was not sure she wanted to know. After dinner, the guests returned to the drawing room. Elizabeth collected glasses. She moved through the edges of the conversation, gathering what needed gathering, replacing what needed replacing, and she was so nearly through the evening. She could feel the end of it, the carriage ride home, the cold quiet of her room, the moment when she could stop holding herself together quite so carefully, when Margaret appeared beside her. Not to speak to her. Margaret would not speak to her here, where someone might notice. But she placed herself close enough that Elizabeth could hear her, and she said, to no one in particular, in a voice pitched just low enough, "Do not embarrass me." Elizabeth looked at the glass in her hand. "I have not embarrassed you," she said, equally quiet. "You are breathing in his direction," Margaret said. "That is sufficient." Then she was gone, moving back into the room with the smooth ease of a woman who has just handled something minor. Elizabeth placed the glass on her tray. She breathed. She counted to 10. It was in the third hour of the evening, when the party had loosened into the comfortable disorder of people who have eaten well and drunk sufficiently, and stopped performing quite so hard, that she found herself in the corner of the room near the window, momentarily trailless, waiting for the footman to return with the next arrangement. The corner was quiet. The curtains were half drawn. Outside, the October dark pressed against the glass, and the elm trees along the drive moved in a wind she couldn't hear but could see. She was looking at the trees when he appeared beside her. Not dramatically, not with announcement. He simply arrived as he had arrived beside a bookshelf 2 years ago, as though it were the most natural thing in the world to be standing exactly there. He said nothing for a moment. She said nothing. Outside, the elm trees moved. "You look cold," he said finally. It was such an ordinary thing to say that she almost laughed. She did not laugh. She kept her eyes on the window. "I am perfectly warm, thank you." "You are standing as far from the fireplace as it is possible to stand in this room." "I prefer the window." "You preferred the bookshelf at Pemberton's." The words landed quietly, without weight, as though he were simply making an observation about interior decoration. Elizabeth turned to look at him. He was looking at the window. His profile was exactly as she remembered it, and she wished it weren't. She wished memory had softened it or altered it into something easier to look at, but it had not. 2 years and it had not changed a single thing. "You recognized me," she said, "when I walked in." "Yes." "Immediately." A pause, "Yes." She looked back at the window. "You said nothing." "You were holding a tray," he said, "and your stepmother was across the room. It did not seem like the moment." The accuracy of this observation was something she did not want to acknowledge, so she didn't. "What does seem like the moment?" she asked instead. He turned to look at her then. She felt it before she saw it, that shift of attention, deliberate and complete. "This," he said simply. She did not know what to do with that word. She had become, over the past 2 years, reasonably competent at not knowing what to do with things. She had put the letters in a box. She had put the box behind a loose board. She had put Clara's note in a drawer. She had put her father's voice and her father's last expression, and the particular way he said "my darling" somewhere deep and load-bearing, and had not gone back to examine it because she could not afford to. She was good at storage. She was good at containment. But this, said in that voice, in that way, quiet, without performance, without anything other than what it was harder to put somewhere. She was trying to find somewhere to put it when Margaret looked across the room. Their eyes met. Margaret's were cold and very clear and communicated, without any words at all, exactly what would happen if Elizabeth did not move away from the window and the Duke of Ravensmore immediately. Elizabeth moved. "I should return too." "I know," he said. She was 3 steps away when his voice found her again, low enough that only she could hear it. "Miss Calloway." She stopped. She did not turn around. "You look well," he said, "despite everything." She stood very still for 1 moment. Then she walked back toward the center of the room, and she kept her eyes down, and she did not look back, and she was fine. She was completely fine, she was. She was not fine, but she was very practiced at the appearance of it, which tonight would have to be enough. The carriages were called at 11. Elizabeth helped with the coats. She stood near the entrance hall door and handed people their wraps and their hats and their gloves, and she looked at no one's face, because looking at faces was finished for the evening. She had used up everything she had. Margaret swept past her with Sophia on her arm, already calculating the evening's returns in the visible way of someone who cannot separate satisfaction from arithmetic. Elizabeth followed them out into the cold. The gravel crunched under her two small shoes. Above the elm trees the sky was very clear and very full of stars, and the cold was the particular clean cold of October that smells like the end of things. She had almost reached the carriage when the footman appeared at her elbow. "Miss." She turned. He was holding a small folded note. No envelope. Her name on the outside in handwriting she recognized despite herself, controlled, precise, with one small inconsistency in the capital E. "His Grace asked me to give you this," the footman said, and then he was gone. She stood in the cold with the note in her hand. Margaret was already in the carriage. In 30 seconds she would notice. Elizabeth looked at the note. Then she put it in her pocket, picked up her skirts and climbed into the carriage. She did not open it until the house was silent and Margaret's light was out, and the only sound was the wind moving in the elm outside her window and the distant protest of a floorboard settling somewhere below. She retrieved it from her pocket, unfolded it by the light of her candle. It was brief. "I still have your silence. I never understood it. I would like to." She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in her pocket, and reached behind the loose board in the floor and took out the box, and opened it for the first time in 2 years. 4 letters, edges soft from handling. She put the note in with them. 5 now. She closed the box. She replaced the board. She sat on the edge of her bed in the candlelight for a long time, looking at nothing. Outside, the wind moved in the elm. "I still have your silence." So did she. The question, the one she had been not asking for 2 years, with great discipline and considerable cost, was whether silence was still the right answer. She blew out the candle. She did not sleep. Margaret knew something had happened. Elizabeth could tell by the quality of the silence at breakfast the next morning, not the ordinary silence of a household that had returned late and risen early, but a particular silence, pointed and deliberate, the kind that is not the absence of words but the careful arrangement of them just out of reach. Margaret ate her toast. She read her correspondence. She did not look at Elizabeth directly, which was worse than being looked at, because Margaret's indirect attention was always more dangerous than her direct attention. Direct attention meant she was reacting. Indirect meant she was thinking. Elizabeth drank her tea and waited. It came at 9:30, when Sophia had gone upstairs, and the breakfast room contained only the two of them and the particular cold light of an October morning that was not interested in flattering anyone. Margaret set down her correspondence. She looked at Elizabeth. "The Duke of Ravensmore," she said, in the voice she used for statements she was presenting as questions, "spoke to you last night." "Briefly," Elizabeth said, "about the room temperature." "About the room temperature." "I was standing near the window. He observed that it was cold." Margaret looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a woman who has not survived 45 years by believing convenient explanations. "He sought you out," Margaret said. "He was passing." "He was not passing. I watched him cross the room." A pause. "He knew your name." Elizabeth set down her teacup with great care. "Many people know my name. My father was Lord Calloway. I was not always." She gestured briefly at the room, at herself, at the gray morning. This. Something moved across Margaret's face. Not guilt. Elizabeth had long since stopped expecting guilt, but something adjacent to it, some acknowledgement that she immediately folded away. "That is precisely my point," Margaret said. "You were Lord Calloway's daughter. You are now a dependent in my household. These are not the same things, and I will not have you behaving as though they are." Elizabeth said nothing. "Sophia," Margaret continued, smoothing her correspondence as though the conversation were already resolved, "has considerable prospects with the Duke. Considerable. Last night was a beginning, not an ending, and I will not have it complicated." She looked up. "Do you understand what I am telling you?" "Perfectly," Elizabeth said. "Good," Margaret returned to her letters. "If he is at any event we attend, and he will be, his circle and ours overlap considerably this season. You will make yourself scarce. You will not seek him out. You will not speak to him unless he speaks first, and if he speaks first you will be brief and you will be dull, and you will find a reason to leave the conversation within 2 minutes. Is that clear?" "Completely," Elizabeth said. Margaret nodded, satisfied. "And Elizabeth," her voice dropped half a register, which was always the most dangerous register, "I am not without options. This house, your place in it, the small comforts you still have, these things are not permanent. They are not guaranteed. They are courtesies I extend at my discretion." She met Elizabeth's eyes. "Do not give me cause to extend them less generously." The morning light came through the window and lay flat and cold across the breakfast table between them. "I understand," Elizabeth said. She did. She understood completely. She had always understood that was the particular cruelty of her situation, that it required no explanation, no spelling out. She understood every word of what Margaret was not saying, every implication, every threatened withdrawal. She understood it the way you understand weather, not because you can stop it, but because understanding it is the only preparation available. She folded her napkin. She excused herself. She went upstairs. In her room, she sat at her writing desk and looked at the blank page in front of her for a long time. Then she took the note from last night out of her pocket and read it again. "I still have your silence. I never understood it. I would like to." She thought about what it would cost to answer it. She thought about what it would cost not to. She put the note back in her pocket and did not write anything, and went to find something useful to do with her hands, because useful things were what got you through mornings like this, and she had learned not to underestimate them. 3 days passed. Then 4, then a week. She did not see Edmund Ashford. She did not expect to. The note sat in the box behind the loose board with the 4 letters, and she did not take it out again, because taking it out meant reading it again, and reading it again meant thinking about it again, and she had allocated precisely no space in her daily arrangements for thinking about it. She was managing this adequately. She was managing this almost completely adequately. On the 8th day, Margaret announced that they had been invited to Lady Forsyth's afternoon tea. A cousin of Margaret's, which meant a room full of people who were Margaret's people, which meant Elizabeth would attend in whatever capacity Margaret decided and would have very little say in the matter. She attended as a guest, which surprised her. A minor guest, seated at the wrong end of the room, introduced briefly and then forgotten, which was fine, which was exactly what she preferred. She found a chair near the window and a cup of tea that was better than expected and settled in for 2 hours of quiet invisibility. She was managing this perfectly well until Lady Forsyth's drawing-room door opened 40 minutes into the tea, and Edmund Ashford walked in. He had not been expected, apparently. There was a flutter of rearrangement, an extra cup appearing, the particular reorganization of a room around a new gravitational center. Lady Forsyth greeted him with the warmth of a woman who considers a duke at her afternoon tea a personal achievement. He greeted the room. He accepted tea. His eyes moved across the assembled guests with the polite interest of a man performing a social obligation. They reached Elizabeth. They stopped. Just for a moment, just long enough. Then they moved on. Margaret had seen it. Elizabeth knew this before she looked, she felt it. The way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. When she glanced across the room, Margaret was already watching her, with an expression that was entirely still and entirely cold and communicated volumes without moving a muscle. Elizabeth looked back at her teacup. She drank her tea. She was the very picture of a woman with no interior life whatsoever. Edmund did not approach her. He moved through the room correctly, spoke to the right people, laughed at the appropriate moments. He spent several minutes in conversation with Margaret and Sophia. Elizabeth watched this from across the room, her teacup very steady in her hands, and she could not hear what was said, but she could see Sophia performing her particular brand of composed attention, and she could see Margaret performing warmth, and she could see Edmund being perfectly pleasant in the manner of a man who is being perfectly pleasant. He glanced at her twice during this conversation. She looked away both times. When Lady Forsyth began to circulate with a second tier of sandwiches, he excused himself from Margaret and Sophia and made his way, not directly, not in a manner that could be described as purposeful, but in the gradual, unhurried way of a man with nowhere in particular to be, toward the window where Elizabeth was sitting. He stopped beside her chair. "Miss Calloway." "Your Grace." He looked at the empty chair beside her. "May I?" She was acutely aware of Margaret on the other side of the room. "I do not think that would be advisable," she said quietly. "Probably not," he agreed, and sat down. She kept her eyes on her teacup. "You did not answer my note," he said. "No. I did not expect you to. I wanted you to know the question existed." She said nothing to this, because there was nothing to say that was safe. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the street was doing its ordinary business. A cart, two women with baskets, a dog that had somewhere important to be. "I am going to ask you something," he said, "and I would like an honest answer if you are willing to give one." She looked at him then, because not looking would have been its own kind of answer. His expression was exactly as it had been at Ashford Hall, steady, unperformed, that particular gray of early morning light. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked. "2 years ago, the letters. I have gone over it a great many times and I cannot find it, but I am aware that is not conclusive." The question was so straightforward and so completely unexpected that something happened behind her sternum that she could not immediately identify. "No," she said, "you did nothing wrong." "Then I do not understand." "I know. Will you help me understand?" She looked back at the window. Across the room she could feel Margaret's attention like a hand on her shoulder, pressing, deliberate, impossible to ignore. "Not here," she said, "not now." A pause, then very quietly, "Then when?" She did not answer. She set down her teacup, excused herself with a murmur he could not have heard, and crossed the room to where a woman she vaguely knew was standing alone beside the fireplace. And she spent the remaining 40 minutes of Lady Forsyth's tea discussing the unreliability of autumn, whether with the focused desperation of someone whose life depends on talking about nothing at all. She did not look at him again. She almost managed it. That evening, Margaret did not speak at dinner. This was worse than speaking. Sophia chattered about the afternoon, Lady Forsyth's new curtains, the sandwiches, a hat that someone had been wearing that Sophia found inadvisable. Margaret made the appropriate sounds. She ate her soup. She cut her meat. She did not look at Elizabeth. Elizabeth ate her dinner and said nothing, and understood that the walls of her life, already close, had moved another inch inward, and that there was nothing to be done about it except breathe in the space that remained. She found the note that night. Not Edmund's note, she already knew where that was. A different note. This one had been placed on her pillow while she was at dinner, in Margaret's handwriting, on a small card that bore no salutation and no signature because none were needed. I warned you. Consider your comforts reviewed accordingly. Elizabeth sat on the edge of her bed and held the card and breathed carefully for a count of 10. Then she went to the loose board in the floor and took out the box and held it in her lap for a long time without opening it, because she did not need to open it. She knew what was inside. She had memorized every word of every letter years ago in the privacy of her own mind, where Margaret could not reach them. That was the thing about words that mattered. You could put them in a box. You could put the box behind a board. You could have them threatened and diminished and surrounded on all sides. But you could not unknow them. She put the box back. She replaced the board. She got into bed and pulled the blanket up and looked at the ceiling. From below, she heard the house settling around her, Margaret's footsteps, Sophia's door, the particular sequence of sounds that meant the household was closing for the night. Elizabeth stared at the ceiling. She thought about Edmund Ashford asking, very quietly then when. She did not have an answer. But for the first time in 2 years, she noticed that she wanted one. The following morning, a note arrived. Delivered by a footman she did not recognize, addressed in handwriting she did, controlled, precise, with the small inconsistency in the capital E that she had memorized without meaning to. She took it upstairs before Margaret saw it. She stood by her window and opened it. It said, "There is a lending library on Marchmont Street. I have been told it is particularly well stocked on Thursday mornings. I have also been told that Thursday mornings are quiet, which I understand some people find preferable to the alternative. I will not be there if you would prefer I wasn't. Lié." Elizabeth stood by the window for a long time. Outside, the October street went about its business. Thursday was 4 days away. She folded the note. She placed it in her pocket. She went downstairs and she ate her breakfast and she said nothing, and she gave Margaret no reason to look at her with anything other than ordinary suspicion. But in her pocket, her fingers found the edge of the folded note. And she thought, Thursday. She went to the library on Thursday. She told Margaret she was going to the dressmaker, which was the kind of errand Margaret never questioned because it implied a level of personal maintenance that Margaret approved of, and Elizabeth rarely bothered with. She put on her best coat, not the gray dress, her own coat, dark blue wool, with buttons that actually fit, and she walked to Marchmont Street in the cold morning air, and she did not think about what she was doing because thinking about what she was doing would have stopped her from doing it. The lending library on Marchmont Street was exactly as described, quiet, well-stocked, smelling of old paper, and the particular dust of rooms that take books seriously. A small bell announced her entry. The librarian looked up, nodded, and returned to his cataloging. She was the only person there. For approximately 4 minutes, she was the only person there. Then the bell above the door rang again. He looked different outside of a formal setting. She registered this before she registered anything else. That without the backdrop of chandeliers and silk and the architecture of a dinner party. He was simply a man in a good coat with his hat in his hand, standing in the doorway of a lending library on a Thursday morning looking at her, with an expression that was very carefully not relief. "You came," he said. "You said you wouldn't be here if I preferred it." "I said I wouldn't be here if you preferred I wasn't." "That is the same thing." "It really isn't." He crossed to where she was standing, beside a shelf of travel narratives she had no interest in, and he stopped at a reasonable distance, close enough to speak quietly, far enough that the librarian across the room had nothing to observe. "You preferred I was here." She looked at the travel narratives. I preferred the library on Marchmont Street on a Thursday morning. Of course, he said, and she could hear the almost smile in it, which was worse than an actual smile because it required no performance. They stayed for an hour and 40 minutes. She knew this because she was aware of time in the particular way of someone operating outside the boundaries of what they have been told is permitted, and every quarter hour that passed was both a relief, still here, still fine, nothing has collapsed, and a small accumulation of something she could not name. They talked about books initially because the setting demanded it, and because it was where they had started 2 years ago, and there was something steadying about returning to the beginning. He had opinions she did not expect. She had opinions he pushed back on, gently, with the specific pleasure of someone who finds disagreement interesting rather than threatening. Then they talked about other things. Not the important things, not yet, not here, not with the librarian 10 feet away and the clock on the wall and the understanding between them that this was already more than it was supposed to be. But the things adjacent to the important things, which sometimes tell you more anyway. He asked how long she had been in her stepmother's house. 2 years, she said, since my father died. I know, he said. I heard. I was sorry. He was a good man. She looked at him. You knew my father. I knew of him, and I knew you had spoken of him with a pause, considerable warmth, at Pemberton's. She had forgotten that she had told him about her father that night, 20 minutes beside a bookshelf, and she had apparently told him about her father. She looked back at the shelf. He was, she said, a good man, yes. Edmund said nothing. He did not fill the silence with consolation or pivot to something easier, which she had long since learned to recognize as the thing people do when grief makes them uncomfortable. He simply let the silence be what it was. She was more grateful for this than she could reasonably express. She told him about Clara on the walk back. Not everything, not yet, but enough. Enough that he would understand why she had not written back. She told it plainly, without editorializing, the way you tell a story when you are still not entirely sure what you think of it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, they walked half a block in silence. She told you, he said finally, that she would ask for nothing else. Yes. And so you asked for nothing. She looked at the pavement. It seemed the right thing. It was a very generous thing, he said, and a very costly one. A pause. Did she know? No. Another pause, longer. Elizabeth. It was the first time he had used her given name. He said it as though he had been careful with it, which perhaps he had. Clara Voss and I spoke once at a garden party for perhaps 10 minutes. She was charming. She is charming, I imagine. I did not think of her afterward. She said nothing. I thought of you, he said simply. After Pemberton's, I thought of you considerably. She kept her eyes on the pavement and breathed carefully. I have 4 letters in a box, she said, behind a loose board in my floor. A silence. You kept them. I kept them. He said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was very even, which she was beginning to understand was what his voice did when he was feeling something he was not going to perform. All 4. All 4. They had reached the corner where their directions diverged. He stopped. She stopped. The morning traffic moved around them without interest. Thursday next, he said. It was not a question. She answered it anyway. Thursday next, she said. Thursday next came. And the Thursday after that. 4 Thursdays in total, each one an hour or 2 at the library on Marchmont Street or walking afterward, or once, sitting in the cold of a park because the library was unexpectedly busy, and neither of them wanted to go home yet. 4 Thursdays of books and conversation, and the slow, careful business of 2 people who have been careful for a long time beginning, very tentatively, to be less careful. Elizabeth was aware that she was happy on Thursdays in a way she was not happy on other days. She was aware that this was dangerous information. She kept it in the same place she kept everything she could not afford to lose, somewhere deep, somewhere load-bearing, somewhere Margaret could not reach. She was managing this. She was managing it well enough that she had almost stopped bracing for the thing that would end it. It ended on a Tuesday. Not in the way things end in the stories she had read, not dramatically, not with a scene that announced its own significance. It ended the way bad things usually end, which is to say it arrived without warning on an ordinary morning in the form of a letter delivered to the house on Grosvenor Street, where Margaret still maintained her social correspondence, despite the fact that the house no longer belonged to any of them. Elizabeth was in the sitting room when Margaret brought the letter in. She knew from the way Margaret was holding it, carefully, at a slight distance, as though it were a thing that required handling, that something had changed. "You have a caller," Margaret said. "I don't understand." "Not today, tomorrow. She has written to request a visit." Margaret set the letter on the table between them. "She says she is an old friend." Elizabeth looked at the letter. The handwriting on the envelope was familiar in the way of things that have been part of your life so long that recognition precedes thought. Dark ink, slightly hurried. The particular loop on the capital C that she had seen on hundreds of notes passed in drawing rooms and slipped under doors over the course of a friendship that had lasted 12 years. Clara. She came at 3 o'clock the following afternoon. She looked well. This was the first thing Elizabeth noticed and immediately felt guilty for noticing, that Clara looked well, better than well, bright-eyed and neatly dressed, and carrying herself with the energy of a woman who has something to say and has been rehearsing how to say it. Margaret left them alone, which surprised Elizabeth, and then did not surprise her, because Margaret leaving them alone meant Margaret believed this visit served her interest somehow. They sat across from each other in the sitting room. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Clara said, "I heard Captain Rowe and I are old news." "I heard something similar," Elizabeth said carefully. "He was," Clara waved a hand. "It doesn't matter, it was not serious." A pause. "He was not serious." Elizabeth nodded. "I have been back in London 3 weeks," Clara said. "I have been meaning to call sooner. I wanted to," she stopped, started again. "Things ended badly and I was embarrassed. I should not have let embarrassment keep me away." This was, Elizabeth recognized, as close to an apology as Clara had ever come for anything. She received it in the spirit in which it was offered. "It is good to see you," she said, and meant it, because despite everything she had a dozen years of her life bound up in the woman across from her, and those years did not simply dissolve because the most recent ones had been difficult. Clara smiled, quick, bright, genuinely relieved. "I have missed you. Terribly. London is very dull without someone to be dreadful to, and you are the only person who appreciates my particular brand of dreadful." Elizabeth almost laughed. Almost. They talked for an hour. It was easier than it should have been, which was both a comfort and a warning. The years fell away in the way they do with people who knew each other before they knew themselves, and there was something real in it, something that reminded Elizabeth of why she had done what she had done 2 years ago, why the sacrifice had seemed worth making. Clara was funny. She was sharp. She was, when she chose to be, one of the most genuinely good company people Elizabeth had ever known. And then, 40 minutes into the visit, something shifted. It was a small shift, the kind that is only visible in hindsight, except that Elizabeth had learned in the past 2 years to watch for small shifts. Clara's conversation had been moving naturally, she told herself later naturally, the way conversations move toward the subject of the season's social events. Who had been where? Who had been seen with whom? And then, "I heard you were at Ashford Hall last month." Elizabeth kept her expression neutral. Margaret was invited. I accompanied her. As a guest. A pause in a supporting capacity. Clara's eyes moved over her face with the quick intelligence that had always been one of her best features, and was occasionally her most dangerous one. I heard, she said very carefully, that the Duke of Ravensmore spoke to you, at some length. People exaggerate, Elizabeth said. People do, Clara agreed, and then sometimes they don't. She set down her teacup. Elizabeth, we are old friends. I would rather ask you directly than hear things third hand. Then ask. Clara looked at her. Is there something between you and Edmund Ashford? The room was very quiet. No, Elizabeth said. And it was true. There was no formal understanding, no declaration, no thing that could be named and presented. There were 4 letters and a note and 4 Thursday mornings and a walk in a park in the cold, and none of these were things she could say. Clara watched her for a moment with the eyes of a woman who has known her for 12 years. Good, she said finally, and her voice was entirely pleasant. Because I intend to renew my acquaintance with him this season, and I would not want there to be any awkwardness. After Clara left, Elizabeth sat in the empty sitting room for a long time. She thought about 12 years of friendship. She thought about a carriage ride home from a garden party and one true thing said in the dark. She thought about 4 letters she had not answered and 4 Thursdays she had. She thought about the fact that Clara had said *I intend, not I hope or I wonder. Clara said *I intend the way Margaret said I will not have it, as a statement of planned reality, not a wish. She thought about Edmund Ashford asking on the first Thursday, did I do something wrong? She thought about Clara, who had not known about the letters, who had not asked Elizabeth to give anything up, who had simply fallen in love at a garden party and said one true thing in a carriage and then gotten on with her life. Who had now come back? Who intended? Elizabeth sat in the empty sitting room and looked at her hands. She had made her choice 2 years ago to protect Clara from something Clara had not known she needed protecting from. She had paid for that choice with 2 years of gray dresses, and loose boards and letters she could not answer, and a friendship that had sent condolences from Bath. And now Clara was back. And Clara intended. And Elizabeth looked at her oldest friend and understood, for the first time, with a clarity that was almost physical, that the sacrifice had been entirely her own. That Clara had not carried any part of it. That Clara did not know there was anything to carry. And that none of it made Clara wrong exactly. It simply made the cost of everything suddenly, brutally visible, in a way it had not been before. She sat with this for a long time. Outside, the afternoon darkened into evening. Thursday was 6 days away. She did not know if she would go. She went. She almost didn't. She stood in the entrance hall of the house on Thursday morning with her coat on and her hat in her hands, and she argued with herself for 7 minutes, which she knew because she counted them, and at the end of 7 minutes she put her hat on and walked out the door. Because the alternative was to put everything back in the box and replace the board and go back to being careful indefinitely, and she had been careful for 2 years, and she was so very tired of the particular weight of it. Edmund was already there when she arrived. He looked up when the bell rang. When he saw her, something in his face settled, the almost imperceptible relaxation of someone who had been waiting without admitting they were waiting. She crossed the room and sat down across from him. "You look like something happened," he said. "Clara Voss is back in London," she said. A silence. He set down the book he was holding. "I see," he said. "She called yesterday. She is—" Elizabeth stopped, started again. "She is as she always was. She intends to renew her acquaintance with you this season." Edmund looked at her steadily. "Does she?" "She does." And you are telling me this because you should know. She folded her hands on the table between them, because I have not been entirely honest about my reasons for not writing back, and you asked me to help you understand, and I think you deserve to. He was quiet for a moment. Elizabeth. She looked at him. I know why you didn't write back, he said. You told me on the walk 3 weeks ago. I told you some of it. You told me enough. He leaned forward slightly. I have not thought of Clara Voss since a garden party 3 years ago. I will not think of her after this conversation. That is not a situation that requires managing. She looked at the table between them. She is my oldest friend, she said quietly. And she does not know. And she came back and she intends, Edmund, and she does not know that there is anything to intend against, and I don't know how to. I know, he said. I don't know what the right thing is. I know. She looked up. He was watching her with that expression she still could not name, steady and particular, and entirely his own. I am not going to make this easier for you, he said. That is not because I don't want to, it is because I can't. This is yours to decide. She sat with that. Outside the library window, the Thursday street went about its business. I kept your letters, she said finally. All 4 for 2 years, behind a board in the floor. I know. I don't know why I'm telling you that. I think you do, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the window. Next Thursday, she said. He said nothing, but when she glanced back at him briefly before she left, the almost smile was there. She was 3 streets from home when she heard her name. She turned. Clara was standing on the pavement 20 feet behind her, shopping basket in hand, with the expression of a woman who has just seen something she was not expecting and is rapidly reassembling herself around it. Her eyes moved from Elizabeth's face to the direction she had come from and back again. Clara, Elizabeth said. Clara looked at her for a long moment. And then, very quietly, with the voice of someone speaking from a place they did not want to be in. Where have you been? It was not a casual question. Elizabeth stood on the pavement in the cold with her hat on and her hands still, and the box of 4 letters, and a note sitting behind a board in a floor at the end of a street she could not go back to yet. She said nothing. Clara's face changed. Elizabeth, her voice had dropped. Tell me you haven't. Clara. Tell me you haven't. Louder now. A woman passing with a perambulator glanced over. After everything. After I told you, Elizabeth. I told you what he meant to me, and you sat there and you held my hand and you said nothing, and now you are. She stopped. Her eyes were bright. How long? It is not what you think. How long? Elizabeth looked at her oldest friend standing on the pavement in the cold, bright-eyed and shaking with something that was equal parts grief and fury, and the particular wound of a woman who believes she has been betrayed. She thought about what she knew and what Clara didn't know. She thought about a carriage ride and one true thing said in the dark. She thought about 4 letters in a box and 2 years of gray dresses, and a friendship that had sent its condolences from Bath. She said, Clara, there are things you don't know. Then tell me. Not here. Then when? Clara's voice cracked on the word. You sound like him. Is that what you talk about when you? She stopped herself, pressed her lips together. When she spoke again, her voice was controlled and very cold. I trusted you. I told you something true and I trusted you with it, and you. You trusted me, Elizabeth said quietly, and I kept that trust for 2 years, at a cost you don't know about because you were not here to see it. Clara stared at her. I will tell you everything, Elizabeth said, all of it, but not on a pavement and not like this. A long silence. The street moved around them. Clara looked at her with 12 years of friendship, and one moment of something harder behind her eyes. Then she turned and walked away. Elizabeth stood on the pavement and watched her go. She thought, I should feel worse than this. She thought, I think I have been feeling worse than this for 2 years already. She put her hands in her pockets and walked home. Clara did not call. Elizabeth waited, not with hope exactly, but with the particular alertness of someone who knows a thing is coming, and would rather it arrived on a schedule she could prepare for. She waited through Thursday, through Friday, through a weekend that passed with the slow weight of weather that cannot decide what it wants to do. Clara did not call. She did not write. She did not send a note, or a message, or any of the small signals that 12 years of friendship had established as the vocabulary of repair after an argument. And Elizabeth, who knew Clara as well as she knew the layout of her own hands, understood that the silence was not the silence of someone who needed time. It was the silence of someone who had made a decision. She found out on Monday. Not from Clara. From Margaret, which was worse, Margaret at breakfast with her correspondence and her particular brightness. The brightness of a woman who has just received information she considers useful. Lady Forsyth's card party this evening, Margaret said without looking up. We are going. I was not aware we had been invited. We have been invited. Clara Voss extended the invitation personally. A pause waited. She specifically requested that you attend. Elizabeth set down her teacup. She thought about what that meant. Clara, who had not called, who had not written, who had walked away on a pavement 3 days ago, now specifically requesting her presence at a card party. She turned it over and examined it, and did not like what she found when she looked at it from every angle. How kind of her, she said. Margaret looked at her over her correspondence. Isn't it, she said. Lady Forsyth's card party was a room full of people Elizabeth knew by sight, and a handful she knew well enough to speak to, arranged around green baize tables with the focused pleasantry of people who take recreational competition seriously. The fire was high. The candles were bright. The conversation was the particular conversation of a Monday evening, relaxed, slightly indiscreet, with the looseness of people who are among their own. Elizabeth arrived with Margaret and Sophia, and accepted a glass of something she did not intend to drink, and found a position near the wall that gave her a clear view of the room and all its exits, which was habit now, which she had stopped apologizing to herself for. She saw Clara immediately. Clara was across the room, in a group of 3 women and 2 men, speaking with the bright animation that was her particular social gift. She did not look at Elizabeth when she entered. She did not look at her for the first 20 minutes of the party, which was itself a kind of looking. Edmund was not there. Elizabeth noticed this, catalogued it, and set it aside. It began at 8:30. She heard it before she understood it, a shift in the conversation nearest to her, the particular drop in register that means something has moved from social to substantive. She caught her own name, and then Clara's voice, carrying farther than it should have in the suddenly quieter room. I have known her all my life, which is why it is so surprising. One would not have thought her capable of it. Elizabeth went very still. Of course the Duke is well. One can hardly blame him for being deceived. She is very careful about how she presents herself, very deliberate. The woman Clara was speaking to said something Elizabeth couldn't hear. Clara shook her head. I saw them myself, Thursday morning, coming from well, and the duration of it apparently, weeks I'm told. She set her cap at him, someone else said, quite deliberately. These things happen, Clara said, and her voice had the precise sadness of a woman being magnanimous about something that is costing her considerably. One simply wishes she had been honest about it rather than. She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. The unfinished sentence was more damaging than anything she could have completed it with. Elizabeth stood at the edge of the room and felt the conversation move outward from Clara like ripples from a stone, faces turning. Not toward her yet, but the particular reorientation of a room that has been given new information and is deciding what to do with it. She breathed. She counted. She thought about walking out. She thought about it seriously for a full count of 5. The door was 15 feet away, her coat was in the hallway. She could be outside and gone before Clara finished her next sentence. Then she thought about what leaving would look like. She stayed. Margaret found her 12 minutes later. She appeared at Elizabeth's elbow with the smooth efficiency of a woman who has been waiting for exactly this moment, and has had her response prepared since before they left the house. "This is unfortunate," Margaret said, in a voice that suggested she found it anything but. "Is it?" Elizabeth said. "Your reputation, such as it is, cannot survive." Margaret, Elizabeth turned to look at her stepmother for the first time all evening. Not now. Something in her voice, or perhaps her expression, which she was not currently managing with her usual care, gave Margaret pause. She looked at Elizabeth for a moment, reassessing. Then she withdrew. The room had shifted. It was subtle. It was always subtle. This was how these things worked. Not with announcement, but with the gradual reorientation of attention, the slight alteration of a glance, the way a conversation stops when you approach and resumes when you leave. Elizabeth moved through it with her chin up and her hands steady, and she thought about gray dresses and loose boards in floors and 4 letters she had kept for 2 years, and she thought, "I have survived worse than a card party." She was across the room from Clara now. Clara had not looked at her directly all evening. She was still talking, still performing her particular brand of sympathetic regret, which was a very effective weapon, and which Elizabeth had always admired in the abstract and was finding considerably less admirable in practice. Elizabeth watched her oldest friend dismantle her character in a room full of people, and she thought about 12 years and a carriage ride, and one true thing, and 2 years of gray dresses, and she thought, "She does not know about the letters. She does not know what I gave up. She does not know." And then, underneath that, the thought she had been keeping behind the loose board in her mind since the pavement 3 days ago. It would not have changed anything if she did. She did not hear him come in. She heard the room change, the slight, collective shift of attention that a room makes when its most significant guest arrives, and she looked toward the door without meaning to, because apparently her body had developed its own opinions about Edmund Ashford that it no longer consulted her about. He stood in the doorway for a moment, hat in hand, speaking to Lady Forsyth with the easy courtesy of a man who has been in a great many rooms and is comfortable in all of them. He looked well. He looked, she took a breath, exactly as he had on Thursday morning in the library, which was the problem with him, that he looked the same everywhere, that he was not a person who required a particular setting to be himself. He looked up. Their eyes met across the room. He read her face in approximately 2 seconds, which was both impressive and alarming, and something shifted behind his expression, not dramatically, but the way the sky shifts when the light changes, everything the same and everything different. He began to move through the room. Not toward her directly. He stopped to greet people, exchanged words, accepted a glass he did not drink from. But the direction of it was unmistakable, at least to her, and apparently to Clara, who had gone very still on the other side of the room. He reached her. He stopped beside her with the same ease as he had stopped beside a bookshelf at Lord Pemberton's dinner party, 3 years ago, as though there were nothing remarkable about it at all. "Miss Calloway," he said. "Your Grace," she said, "you should know that the room is." "I know what the room is," he said. "I heard on the way in." He looked at her steadily. "Are you all right?" "I am perfectly." "Elizabeth." She stopped. "I am managing," she said, which was more honest. He nodded. Then he turned to look at the room, at the people who were not watching them and were watching them, at Clara, across the far side, who had gone very still with the stillness of someone containing something large, and he was quiet for a moment. Then he held out his arm. Not subtly, not in a way that could be mistaken for anything other than what it was, a deliberate, unhurried, entirely public gesture. His arm extended in a room full of people who were now unambiguously watching. She stared at it. "They are all watching," she said quietly. "Yes," he said, "that is rather the point." She looked at his arm. She thought about Margaret in the corner and Clara across the room, and the woman near the fireplace who had said she set her cap at him, and the particular, unbeatable arithmetic of a reputation being discussed in a room you are standing in. She thought about gray dresses and loose boards, and 4 letters kept for 2 years for no reason she had ever been able to entirely explain to herself. She thought about Thursday mornings on Marchmont Street. She took his arm. The room did not gasp. Rooms like this never gasped. They were too well trained for that. But she felt the collective intake of something, the pause, the recalculation, the rapid reassessment of everything that had just been said in the previous 40 minutes. Edmund walked her to the far side of the room with the unhurried ease of a man taking a turn about a garden, and the people between them divided like water around a boat, and he said something quiet and inconsequential about the card tables on their left, and she replied with something equally inconsequential, and they were both performing normalcy with such commitment that by the time they reached the window, the room had mostly resumed its business. Mostly. Clara had not moved. She was standing exactly where she had been standing, and she was looking at them, at Elizabeth specifically, with an expression Elizabeth had never seen on her face before. Not anger exactly, not just anger. Something more complicated and more painful than anger, the expression of someone whose story about how things are has just been revised without their permission. Elizabeth met her eyes. She did not look away. Neither did Clara. Then Clara turned and spoke to the woman beside her, and the conversation continued, and the evening continued, and the room moved on in the way rooms do, absorbing the thing that has happened into the ongoing business of itself. Edmund stayed beside her for the rest of the evening. He did not make a speech. He did not confront Clara or address the room or do anything that could be described as dramatic. He simply remained present, steady, entirely uninterested in leaving her side, and this, Elizabeth was beginning to understand, was its own kind of statement. Not the loud kind. The kind that doesn't need to be loud because it has already decided. At 10:30, he brought her a glass of water she had not asked for. At 11:15, he said something about a book she had mentioned on Thursday that made her almost laugh in spite of everything. At 11 o'clock, the carriages began to be called. Margaret appeared at Elizabeth's elbow with the expression of a woman who has spent the evening doing very rapid calculations and has arrived at a sum she did not expect. "We are leaving," she said. "Yes," Elizabeth said. She turned to Edmund. "Good evening, Your Grace," she said, with the composure of someone who has held themselves together all evening and intends to continue doing so for approximately another 15 minutes. He looked at her. "Good evening, Miss Calloway." A pause. "Thursday," he said very quietly. It was not a question. "Thursday," she said. In the carriage, Margaret said nothing. Sophia said nothing. The 3 of them rode home through the London dark in a silence that contained a great many things, none of which were spoken, and Elizabeth sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked out at the street and breathed carefully. She was not fine precisely, but she was something better than she had been at the beginning of the evening, which she had not expected, and which she turned over carefully in the privacy of her own mind like something fragile that might not survive examination. He had offered her his arm in front of everyone. She had taken it. The room had watched. And she was still here in a carriage, going home, and the world had not ended. She was almost at her door when the footman appeared. She recognized him, the same footman as Ashford Hall, the same quiet efficiency. He handed her a folded note and disappeared before she could speak. She carried it upstairs. She sat on the edge of her bed and opened it by the light of her candle. It was brief. Tomorrow, not Thursday. Tomorrow, if you are willing. There is something I should have said a long time ago, and I find I am no longer interested in waiting until Thursday to say it. Lié. She read it twice. Then she placed it in the box with the others, 6 now. 6 letters from a man who had been looking for the right moment for 3 years, and she blew out the candle and lay back in the dark. Tomorrow. She closed her eyes. For the first time in 2 years, she slept. She was ready at 9 o'clock. Not because he had specified a time. The note had said only tomorrow, but because she had been awake since 6 and had done everything she could think of to do with her hands and her mourning and her considerable reserves of patience, and by 9 o'clock she had run out of all 3. She sat in the small chair by her window in her blue coat with her hat in her lap, and she watched the street below, and she waited. Margaret had not come down yet. Sophia was still asleep, she could hear, or imagine she could hear, the particular silence of a house in which certain people have not yet begun their day. The kitchen was active somewhere below, and the ordinary sounds of the household going about its morning business rose through the floors, and Elizabeth sat in her chair and looked at the street and was, for once, entirely present in her own life, not bracing for anything, not managing anything. Simply there, in the chair in the morning, waiting. She did not examine this too carefully in case it stopped. He came at 9:30. Not to the door, he was not so careless as that, and neither was she. His note had said nothing about logistics because he had understood she would work them out, which she had, in the 6 o'clock dark with her eyes on the ceiling. There was a small park 3 streets from the house, not fashionable, not frequented by anyone Margaret knew, the kind of park that exists for the people who live near it rather than the people who like to be seen. She had walked there in all seasons for 2 years, because it had a bench in the far corner behind an elm tree that was the nearest thing she had found to a room of her own. She was sitting on the bench when he came through the gate. He found her without difficulty, which meant he had thought about where she would be, which she added to the list of things she was not examining too carefully. He sat beside her. The elm was bare now. November had finished what October had started, and the sky above them was the particular white of a day that has not decided between cloud and sun, and has settled on a compromise that satisfies no one. The park was empty, except for a groundskeeper raking leaves in the far distance who had no interest in them whatsoever. They sat for a moment without speaking. This was one of the things she had learned about him, in the library on Marchmont Street and in the cold of a park, and on walks that had gone longer than either of them had announced, that he was not afraid of silence. Most people were. Most people filled silence with whatever was nearest to hand, and the quality of what they reached for told you more about them than anything they said on purpose. Edmund did not reach for anything. He simply waited, with the patience of someone who has decided that what comes next is worth waiting for. She had loved, she had appreciated this about him for some time. She was done pretending the difference. "Last night," he said finally. "Last night," she agreed. "Are you?" "I am fine," she paused. "I am better than fine, which I did not expect." He nodded, as though this confirmed something. "Clara," she said. "Yes." She did not know about the letters, about any of it. She did not know what she was undoing, Edmund. I want you to understand that. I understand that, he said. It doesn't, he stopped. What she did last night was wrong. The not knowing doesn't change what she chose to do with what she thought she knew. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. No, she said, it doesn't. She had been sitting with this since the carriage ride home, this particular grief, which was different from anger, cleaner than anger, the grief of understanding something fully that you had been only partially understanding before. Clara had not known about the letters. Clara had not asked her to give anything up. Clara had fallen in love at a garden party and said one true thing in a carriage, and then built an entire architecture of expectation around something that had never been promised to her. And when that architecture was threatened, she had reached for the nearest available weapon, which had been Elizabeth. I think, Elizabeth said slowly, that I have been protecting someone who was not protecting me for a very long time. Edmund said nothing. He did not offer a verdict on this. She was grateful for that. I think I knew, she said. Somewhere, I think I have known for longer than I want to admit. The letters, he said quietly, you kept them. Yes. That was not the behavior of someone who had forgotten. No, she said, it was not. He turned to look at her then. She felt it before she turned to meet it, that quality of attention, full and deliberate, that she had been the subject of since a dinner party 3 years ago, and had spent considerable energy trying to file under asterisk coincidence and circumstance. And do not be foolish, Elizabeth. She met his eyes. The morning light was doing its indecisive best between the bare branches of the elm, and his expression was the one she had been cataloging and failing to name for months, steady, unhurried, entirely certain of itself. I want to ask you something, he said. You said that once before, in Lady Forsyth's sitting room. I did, and you answered honestly, which I appreciated. A pause. I am going to ask you something else now. She waited. Why did you keep them, he said. The letters, 2 years behind a board in the floor through everything that happened. You could have burned them, it would have been safer. It would have been, he paused, considerably less complicated. She looked at the bare elm in front of them. She thought about 6 o'clock in the dark and her eyes on the ceiling, and the question she had been not asking herself for 2 years with great discipline and considerable cost. I don't know, she said. He waited. That is not true, she said. I do know. I have known for quite some time. She stopped, began again. I kept them because they were from you, and because everything else in my life was being taken from me or diminishing or changing into something I did not recognize, and those letters were. She stopped. They were what? He said quietly. They were evidence, she said, that I had been seen before everything, that someone had that you had. She pressed her lips together. It seemed important to keep evidence of that. The park was very quiet. The groundskeeper had moved to the far end of the path, his rake scraping steadily against the gravel, and above them the elm moved slightly in a wind too gentle to feel, and the sky continued its negotiations between cloud and sun. Edmund was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was very even, which she had learned was what his voice did when he was feeling something he was not going to perform. You kept them, he said. Yes. All four. All four. He reached into his coat pocket. He placed something on the bench between them, a letter, folded, sealed, her name on the outside in the handwriting she had memorized without meaning to. I wrote 12, he said quietly, after Pemberton's, over the course of that year. She stared at the letter on the bench. You wrote 12, I sent 4, he paused. I burned the other 8 when it became clear you had made your answer plain. Something happened in her chest that she did not have a name for. 8 letters. 8 letters she would never read, that no longer existed, that were ash somewhere, that had been written and kept, and finally given up on by a man who had taken her silence for an answer she had never intended to give. "Edmund, the letter on the bench," he said, "is not one of the 8. I did not write it then." His eyes met hers. "I wrote it this morning before I came here." She looked at the letter between them. "It is dated today," he said. "I wanted there to be a record of the exact moment I stopped being patient and became something else entirely." She looked at him. "What," she said carefully, "is something else entirely?" He looked at her with that expression, that particular gray of early morning light, steady and deliberate and entirely certain of itself. "Pick up the letter," he said, "and find out." Her hands were steady. She was proud of her hands. She picked up the letter. She broke the seal. She unfolded it in the cold morning air under the bare elm tree, with the groundskeeper raking gravel in the distance, and the sky still negotiating with itself overhead. It was not long. It was, in fact, the shortest letter he had ever written her, which seemed right, which seemed like the exact right length for something that had been 3 years in the arriving. She read it once. Then she looked up at him. "You are certain," she said. Her voice was steady. She was less proud of everything else. "I have been certain," he said, "since a dinner party at Lord Pemberton's house 3 years ago, when a woman I did not know told me that most people find Montaigne tedious because it requires them to question themselves." The almost smile. "I have not been uncertain since." She looked back at the letter. She read the last line again. "I am asking, Elizabeth, simply and without complication, whether you will allow me to stop writing letters and begin something that does not need to be kept in a box." She folded the letter. She placed it carefully in her coat pocket, beside her own hands, and she looked at Edmund Ashford sitting beside her on a bench in an unfashionable park on a white November morning, and she thought about everything she had kept behind a board in the floor, and everything she had spent 2 years not asking herself, and everything she had lost, and everything she had held onto when she should have let go, and everything she had let go of when she should have held on. And she said, "I should like to write you a letter." He looked at her. "I have owed you one," she said, "for 3 years." Something moved across his face, not the almost smile, something more than that, something she did not need to name because she recognized it. She had been recognizing it in herself for long enough to know it when she saw it in someone else. "I have paper," he said, "if you need it." She almost laughed. She did laugh. It was the first time she had laughed a real laugh, not the social kind, in longer than she could remember, and it came out slightly unsteadily, and she did not care, because he was laughing too, quietly, and the groundskeeper continued raking gravel without any interest in either of them. And the sky finally made up its mind and let through a long blade of pale November sun that fell across the bench and the bare elm and the two of them sitting in it. And she thought, "Lo, so this is what it feels like when you stop being careful." She went home at noon. Margaret was in the sitting room when she came in, with the expression of a woman who has been waiting and has prepared several versions of what she wants to say depending on what she finds. She looked at Elizabeth. Elizabeth looked back at her. Something in what Margaret saw in Elizabeth's face, or her posture, or the particular quality of a woman who has stopped bracing for things, made her pause. The prepared versions arranged themselves behind her eyes and then, one by one, stood down. "Well," Margaret said finally. "Well," Elizabeth agreed. She took off her coat. She went upstairs. She sat at her writing desk and she took out a piece of paper and she picked up her pen. She wrote for a long time. When she was finished, she read it back once and folded it, and wrote his name on the outside. Then she went to the loose board in the floor and took out the box, and opened it for the second time in a month. 6 letters inside, 4 of his, 1 note, 1 letter from this morning. She put hers in with them. 7 now. She held the box for a moment. Then she replaced the board out of habit, out of something older than habit, and went downstairs to find a footman to deliver what she had written. His response arrived before dinner. 4 words on a card, in the handwriting she had memorized without meaning to. Tomorrow, not Thursday, tomorrow. She stood in the hallway with the card in her hand and she smiled. Not the social kind, not the managed kind, not the kind she had been producing on demand for 2 years while everything else was kept somewhere load-bearing and private. The real kind. The kind that does not need an audience. That night she reached behind the loose board one last time. She took out the box. She opened it. She sat on the edge of her bed and she looked at what was inside, 7 letters, the whole careful record of 3 years of silence and patience, and something that had refused, despite everything, to become nothing. She thought about 8 letters that no longer existed. She thought about what it cost to wait. She thought about what it cost not to. Then she put the box on her bedside table, not behind the board, not in the wardrobe, not hidden, and she lay down and looked at the ceiling and thought. Tomorrow. For the first time in 2 years, she did not have to count to 10. The wedding was small. This had been Elizabeth's only firm requirement, stated once and not argued, with no grand ceremony, no assembled London, no room full of people performing their feelings about a union that was nobody's business but theirs. Edmund had agreed without hesitation, which she had taken as further evidence that she had, against considerable odds, made the correct decision. 12 people attended. A church in the country, near the Derbyshire village they had both, at different times and for different reasons, spent a summer they both remembered as unusually peaceful. Snow on the ground outside. A fire inside. The particular quiet of a room in which everyone present has actually been invited. Her father's solicitor, a man who had spent 2 years looking personally distasteful about things he found professionally binding, wept openly during the vows, which Elizabeth found both surprising and rather satisfying. Margaret and Sophia had left the house on Grosvenor Street in January. Not dramatically, not with a scene. Margaret was many things, but she was not a woman who wasted energy on battles she had already lost. She recognized a changed calculation and adjusted accordingly, and within a fortnight of Edmund's formal call, she had begun arranging a quiet relocation to her cousin's house in Wiltshire, where she was understood to have gone for her health. Sophia went with her. On the last morning, as the trunks were being loaded into the carriage, Margaret had paused at the door. She had looked at Elizabeth. Elizabeth had looked back at her. Margaret had said nothing. She had simply nodded, a small, contained nod, the nod of a woman acknowledging a game concluded, and then she had gone. Elizabeth had stood in the empty hallway for a moment. Then she had gone upstairs and begun deciding what to do with her father's books. Clara did not come to the wedding. She had not been invited, which perhaps explained it. They had spoken once, in February, in the sitting room of a mutual acquaintance, who had engineered the meeting with the optimism of someone who believes that 12 years of friendship can survive anything given sufficient tea and goodwill. It had been a short conversation, honest, in the way of things said by people who have run out of other options. Clara had said, "I did not know about the letters." "I know," Elizabeth said. "If I had known," she stopped, started again. "I cannot promise I would have behaved differently. I want to say I would have, but I cannot promise it." Elizabeth had looked at her oldest friend, at 12 years of shared shorthand and finished sentences, and the particular bond of people who have known each other before they knew themselves. And she had thought about what honesty costs and what it is worth. "I know," she said again. They had not seen each other since. Perhaps they would, eventually. Perhaps the distance between where they were and where they had been was not permanent. Elizabeth did not know. She held the question without urgency, the way you hold things that belong to the future lightly, with the understanding that some answers arrive only when they are ready. On a morning in March, 3 weeks after the wedding, Elizabeth was in the library at Ravensmoor, her library now, a fact she had not yet entirely absorbed despite considerable evidence, when she found the book. It was Montaigne. Old, slightly battered, the spine cracked from use. She recognized it before she understood why, and then she understood why because she had held it in her hands once before at a dinner party at Lord Pemberton's house, 4 years ago, when a man she had not yet met had appeared beside a bookshelf and told her she looked like she was hiding. She turned it over in her hands. On the inside cover, in handwriting she recognized, controlled, precise, the small inconsistency in the capital E was a date, 4 years ago, and beneath it one line. For when she finally comes to find it. She stood in the library for a long moment. Then she went to find him. He was in the study at the end of the hall, at his desk, reading something that he set down when she appeared in the doorway holding the Montaigne. He looked at the book, then at her. "You kept it here," she said, "all this time." "I kept it," he said, "yes." She looked at him, at this man who had written 12 letters and sent 4 and waited 3 years with the patience of someone who believed that what was worth having was worth waiting for. And she thought about boxes and loose boards and evidence of being seen. She crossed the room. She sat in the chair beside his desk. She opened the Montaigne to the essay they had argued about 4 years ago, beside a bookshelf at a dinner party, before either of them knew what they were beginning. "He writes better than he is given credit for," she said. Edmund looked at her for a moment with that expression, the one she had finally named, on a bench in an unfashionable park on a white November morning. "He does," he said. And they read in the quiet of the library, with the March light coming through the tall windows, and the house settling around them in the way of houses that have been waiting for this particular arrangement, and no one keeping count of anything at all. That evening, Elizabeth went to her dressing table and opened the drawer. The box was there. She had moved it from behind the loose board the night Edmund had offered her his arm in a room full of people, and it had lived in the drawer since, which was not hiding and was not displaying but was simply keeping, which felt like the right word for it now. She opened it. 7 letters inside. She took them out, one by one, and laid them on the dressing table in order, 4 of his, 1 note, 1 letter from a November morning, 1 of hers. She looked at them for a long time. Then she picked up her pen and took a fresh piece of paper and wrote the date at the top. She was not writing to anyone. She was simply writing about the dinner party and the bookshelf, and the 20 minutes beside it, and the 4 letters she had kept for 2 years behind a board in the floor, and the 8 she would never read, and the bench in the park, and the groundskeeper raking gravel, and the November sun coming through the bare elm. About what it costs to be careful. About what it costs not to be. When she finished, she folded it and placed it in the box with the others. 8 letters now. She closed the box. She put it back in the drawer, not hidden, not displayed, simply kept, and she went downstairs to where Edmund was waiting in a house that was hers now, in a life that was hers now, and she did not count to 10. She had not needed to, for quite some time. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.